The first snowfall of the season blanketed the neighborhood in a pristine sheet of white, muffling the usual suburban hum. Regina Courtney stood on her front porch, smiling as she took in the peaceful scene. The air was crisp but not bitter, the perfect kind of winter day that called for hot chocolate, warm scarves, and, most importantly, snowmen. Her niece, Lily, who was visiting for the weekend, tugged eagerly at her hand. "Auntie, can we make a snowman?" Regina chuckled. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's make the best one on the block." Bundled up in their winter coats, the two of them set to work. Regina's years of experience in snowy winters served them well. Within an hour, their snowman had taken shape, standing tall with 3 perfectly rounded sections. Lily ran inside to fetch some supplies while Regina smoothed out the edges, humming to herself. When Lily returned, she had a small box filled with decorations, a carrot for the nose, shiny black buttons for eyes, and an old scarf that Regina had dug out from the closet. They placed each piece carefully, giggling as they adjusted the carrot just right. "There," Regina said, stepping back to admire their work. "What do you think?" Lily's face lit up. "He's perfect." Regina gave her niece a warm hug. It was the kind of day that reminded her why she loved this neighborhood, quiet, safe, filled with memories. But peace, as always, was fragile. Across the street, an upstairs curtain twitched. A pair of cold, beady eyes locked onto the scene. Karen Johnston, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had been watching them. And she didn't like what she saw. Karen Johnston had lived in the neighborhood for years, ruling over it like a bitter, self-important dictator. The HOA wasn't just an organization to her, it was her personal empire, and she wielded its rules like a sword. She had fined people for the most trivial things: flower pots that weren't a uniform color, holiday lights that stayed up a day too long, kids leaving bikes in their driveways. And though she tried to justify it with HOA policies, everyone knew the truth: Karen only enforced rules when it suited her. And now, she had found her latest target. The sight of Regina and Lily's snowman made her blood boil. It wasn't against the rules, of course. Plenty of families built snowmen in their yards every winter. But this was Regina, and that was all the reason Karen needed. She stormed outside, her boots crunching against the snow. Regina, still admiring the snowman, barely had time to turn around before Karen was upon them. "What do you think you're doing?" Karen snapped. Regina blinked. "Building a snowman," she said, as if stating the obvious. Karen scoffed. "This is a neighborhood, Regina. Not some playground. There are rules about keeping properties looking presentable." Regina folded her arms. "It's a snowman, Karen. He's not hurting anyone." Karen's lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Her eyes darted toward Lily, who had moved behind Regina, sensing the tension. "You can't just put whatever you want in your yard," Karen seethed. "You're bringing down the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I run the HOA, and I say it needs to go." Regina let out a slow breath, reining in her frustration. "Karen, I've lived here for over 20 years. You don't own my yard. And last I checked, there's nothing in the HOA rules about snowmen." Karen's face twisted with rage. "You always think you can do whatever you want. I am tired of you acting like this neighborhood belongs to you." And then, before Regina could react, Karen lashed out. With a furious kick, she sent the snowman's head flying off its shoulders. The button eyes scattered across the snow like tiny black pebbles. The carrot nose landed several feet away, half buried in the powder. Another kick, and the middle section collapsed in on itself. Lily let out a horrified gasp. "You ruined it." Karen whirled toward the little girl, her eyes gleaming with self-righteous satisfaction. "It's my job to keep this neighborhood in order," she said smugly. Regina was frozen in shock. Not because she hadn't expected Karen to be petty, but because of how far she had taken it. Destroying a child snowman. For what? Power? Spite? Lily's face crumpled, and she burst into tears. Without another word, she turned and ran inside. Regina's jaw clenched as she slowly stepped forward, planting herself between Karen and the wreckage of their afternoon. "You had no right," she said, her voice low and steady. Karen only smirked. "Oh, please. It's just a pile of snow." Regina shook her head. "No, Karen. It was more than that. It was something my niece and I built together. It was ours. And you destroyed it because you think you can control everything." Karen crossed her arms. "I can and I will. If you don't like it, you can take it up with the HOA board." Regina stared at her for a long moment. And then, without another word, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Karen's smug expression vanished. "What are you doing?" she snapped. Regina held the phone to her ear, her gaze never leaving Karen's. "Reporting you for trespassing and vandalism." Karen laughed, but it was thin, nervous. "You're insane. The police aren't going to waste their time on a stupid snowman." But Regina wasn't backing down. And as the first wail of sirens echoed through the street, Karen's smirk disappeared entirely. Karen's smirk twitched as the sirens grew louder. Her bravado faltered, but she quickly covered it up with an indignant scoff. "You really called the cops over a snowman? You're pathetic," she sneered, folding her arms across her chest. Regina didn't flinch. She simply kept the phone pressed to her ear, calm as ever. "Yes, officer. My neighbor trespassed onto my property, destroyed personal property, and is now harassing me. Yes, she's still here." Karen's nostrils flared as she turned toward the growing crowd of neighbors who had stepped outside, drawn by the escalating scene. Some stood on their porches, arms crossed, while others whispered among themselves. A few had even pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. Regina noticed it too. Karen had always loved playing queen of the HOA, issuing ridiculous fines and enforcing made-up rules, but now she was on full display, and people were watching. "You really think they're going to do anything?" Karen snapped, her voice rising an octave. "The police don't care about you. You're wasting their time." Regina kept her voice level. "I guess we'll see." Karen's face darkened, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for something to say. But before she could speak, a black and white patrol car pulled up, tires crunching against the snow-covered road. Two officers stepped out, their breath visible in the cold air. The first officer, a tall man with a calm yet authoritative presence, approached Regina. "Ma'am, we got a call about a disturbance. Are you all right?" Regina nodded. "I'm fine, but I'd like to report trespassing and property destruction." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes, turned toward Karen, who immediately threw her hands up in exasperation. "Oh, for God's sake. You're really calling this trespassing? I was just doing my duty as head of the HOA. That snowman was an eyesore." The male officer arched a brow. "Ma'am, that snowman was on her property." Karen scoffed. "The HOA has rules." "But was there a specific rule against snowmen?" the female officer asked. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's implied." The officers exchanged glances. One of the neighbors, Mr. Thompson, spoke up. "It's not against the rules. Plenty of us have snowmen in our yards right now." Karen shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The officers had heard enough. "All right," the male officer said, turning back to Karen. "Ma'am, did you step onto your neighbor's property and destroy her snowman?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she hesitated. She knew if she admitted it, she was done. But everyone had seen her do it. There was no way out of this. "That's not the point," she snapped. She's always causing problems in this neighborhood. She doesn't belong here. The words slipped out before she could stop them. A collective gasp spread through the crowd. Regina felt her stomach turn, but she wasn't surprised. She had known all along that this was about more than just HOA rules. The female officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, that's enough." But Karen wasn't done. "No. You don't understand. This isn't fair. I've worked too hard to let her ruin this neighborhood." Then, in a split-second burst of desperation, Karen lunged at Regina. Regina barely had time to react before Karen's hands shot forward, aiming to shove her backward. But she never made it. The female officer was faster. In one smooth motion, she pulled out her taser and fired. The prong struck Karen's coat, and a high-pitched zap filled the air. Karen let out a strangled yelp as her entire body seized up. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed into the snow with a dull thud, limbs twitching from the electric current. The entire street went silent. For a few seconds, all anyone could hear was Karen's ragged breathing and the crackling of static as the taser completed its cycle. Then, slowly, the officers stepped forward. "You were warned," the male officer said, kneeling down to handcuff Karen's wrists behind her back. "You're under arrest for assault, harassment, and trespassing." Karen, still dazed, tried to sputter out a response. But, I didn't mean to." The female officer sighed. "Ma'am, we have multiple witnesses. You attacked your neighbor twice in front of officers." One of the younger neighbors, a teenager with a phone in hand, snickered. "I got the whole thing on video." Karen's face twisted in horror as she realized what had just happened. She had lost. As the officers lifted her to her feet, Karen's eyes darted around, searching for anyone to defend her. But the neighbors had turned their backs. Even the people who once tolerated her nonsense were shaking their heads. Regina simply stood there, watching in silence. Not with smug satisfaction, not with glee, just quiet relief. As Karen was led toward the police car, the officer turned to Regina. "Would you like to press charges?" Regina exhaled, glancing at Lily, who had peeked out from the front door, wide-eyed. "Yes," Regina said firmly. "I would." Karen let out a howl of protest as the officers secured her in the back of the car. "This isn't fair. I'm the victim." The officers ignored her. The car door slammed shut, muffling her protests as the engine rumbled to life. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Some even approached Regina, offering quiet words of support. Mr. Thompson patted her shoulder. "You did the right thing." Regina nodded. She turned to Lily, who looked up at her, still holding the now cold cup of hot chocolate. "Is the mean lady gone?" Lily asked hesitantly. Regina smiled gently. "Yes, baby. She's gone." Lily beamed. "Can we build another snowman?" Regina chuckled. "Of course. But this time, let's make it even bigger." And as they knelt in the snow, rolling the first ball into place, a sense of peace finally settled over the neighborhood. For the first time in years, it truly felt like home again. As the police car disappeared down the street with Karen still screaming inside, the tension in the neighborhood began to fade like the last remnants of a winter storm. The gathered neighbors exchanged looks, some amused, some relieved, and some just outright exhausted from years of dealing with Karen's antics. Regina let out a deep breath, her hands still trembling slightly. She had stood up to plenty of nonsense before, but this? This had been something else. Lily tugged at Regina's coat. "Is she coming back?" she asked, her big eyes filled with worry. Regina knelt down, brushing some stray snowflakes from Lily's hair. "Not for a long time, sweetheart," she assured her. "And when she does, she won't be in charge of anything anymore." Lily's face lit up at that. A voice called out from the side. "Hey, Regina. Regina turned to see Mr. Thompson, a retired schoolteacher, stepping forward. Behind him, a few other neighbors had gathered, their expressions apologetic. "Listen," Mr. Thompson continued, rubbing the back of his neck. "I think I speak for a lot of us when I say, we should have done something about Karen a long time ago." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. "She's bullied all of us," said Mrs. Patel, who lived 2 houses down. "But I think we all knew she was hardest on you." Regina gave a knowing smile. "I noticed." The neighbors chuckled, but there was a hint of guilt behind their laughter. They had let Karen run unchecked for years, allowing her to dictate the smallest details of their lives under the guise of HOA regulations. "Well, we won't make that mistake again," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "We're calling for an emergency HOA meeting tonight. And we're voting her out." Regina raised an eyebrow. "You can do that?" Mrs. Patel grinned. She made the HOA rules so complicated even she didn't read them all. "Turns out, a majority vote can remove a board member." A slow, satisfied smile spread across Regina's face. "Now that's a policy I can get behind." "Darn right," Mr. Thompson agreed. "And once she's gone, we're rewriting those ridiculous rules. No more Karen-level nonsense." Lily perked up. "So we can have snowmen all the time?" Regina laughed. "Looks like it." Actually, another neighbor piped up, "Why stop at just one? We should build an entire army of snowmen. Right here, in front of Regina's house, just to celebrate." The idea spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the entire block was alive with laughter and energy as neighbors, grown-ups, kids, even some grumpy old-timers, gathered in Regina's yard, rolling snow into massive mounds. Regina and Lily worked side by side, rebuilding their own snowman first. This time, it was bigger, stronger, and prouder. And as the first snowman was completed, Regina couldn't help but feel it, the neighborhood had finally changed for the better. The emergency HOA meeting took place that night in Mr. Thompson's spacious living room. Almost everyone in the neighborhood attended, squeezed together on couches, chairs, and standing near the walls. For the first time in years, the atmosphere was light, hopeful, because for once, the meeting wasn't about Karen barking at them over grass heights or mailbox colors. It was about getting rid of her. Regina sat near the front, listening as Mr. Thompson read aloud the proposal to permanently remove Karen Johnston from the HOA board. The vote was put to the floor. "All in favor?" he asked. Hands shot up. Regina scanned the room. Nearly every single person had their hand raised. Even the few who used to defend Karen had given up. Mr. Thompson grinned. "Well, that's that. Karen Johnston is officially removed from the HOA." The room erupted into cheers and applause. Regina exhaled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. Karen had spent years making her feel unwelcome in the very place she had called home for decades. But now, she was free. After the meeting, neighbors gathered around Regina, offering hugs, handshakes, and apologies. "We should have spoken up sooner," one man admitted. "But you did now," Regina said kindly. "That's what matters." A few hours later, as she and Lily returned home, Regina paused to take in the sight of dozens of snowmen standing proudly in her front yard. It was a symbol of unity, of defiance, and of something Karen could never take away, joy. Lily took her hand. "Auntie Regina?" "Yes, sweet pea. I think this is the best day ever." Regina smiled, squeezing Lily's hand. "Me too, baby. Me too." And as they stepped inside, closing the door behind them, they left the chaos of the past outside in the cold where it belonged.